Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier. And in this last key issues presentation on the core topics, I'm going to look at the Gulf topic and cover the context to the topic as a whole, as well as the 5 issues highlighted by the syllabus and the key factors for you to think about in each of them. Now, I'm a great believer in the importance of context. History does not happen in a void, and the context to the Gulf topic is both huge in size and in significance. I think I take about 8 pages outlining it in my ebook, The Gulf at War with Itself. That's how important I think it is. I'm not going to take that amount of time today, but I will give you the essence of that context. Since the end of World War II, the Middle East has changed from being a backward region dominated by Britain and France to being an extremely prosperous and independent region with some of the very highest GDP rates per capita in the world. Yet it still has a strong foreign influence. It's just that the source of that influence has changed. For increasingly, since World War II, it has been an American and a Soviet presence. And it has been a region that has grabbed the world's attention with uprisings, revolutions, civil war, and regional wars. What are the dominant themes that unfold as we look at an overview of the history of the region? The withdrawal of Britain and France from their imperial presence in the region, replaced by a growing American presence, which has been challenged by a growing Soviet presence. And concurrent with that, and butting against both the old and the new imperialists, the growth of nationalism. Yet, at the same time, and only complicating matters even more, a conflict within nationalism between those looking to westernize and modernize and conservative forces, which led to the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. There is too, since 1948, the presence of a Jewish state, Israel, in this overwhelmingly Arab Islamic region. Though it is also important to note Iran's Persian ethnicity and culture. Europe and America felt morally obliged to support the creation of Israel, but its creation was at the cost of taking land from the Palestinians and the bitter hostility of Arab nations. And finally, but by no means least, there is also the region's great economic asset, oil. When in 1973 the OPEC countries of the Middle East enforced an oil embargo on America and the West in response to their support of Israel in the Yom Kippur War, prices rose 4-fold, leading to petrol shortages, power cuts, and much reduced industrial production. All this served to show how reliant on Gulf oil Western economies had become, and so how vulnerable they were. It was a very different situation to back in 1950, when production had been dominated by British and American companies. British in Iraq and Iran, and American in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait and Iraq. So, to the rise to power of Saddam Hussein. You need to be aware of what Saddam was fighting for and fighting against. Saddam's uncle, Karilla Tulfa, was a major influence on the young Saddam in 3 ways. He instilled into Saddam a strong sense of Arab nationalism, and with it a hatred of the Hashemite monarchy that allowed Iraq to remain under the dominant influence of Britain, and he also inspired Saddam to join the Ba'ath Party, which he joined in 1957. And you will need to know just how Saddam worked his way to the top of the Ba'ath Party, how he proved to be a force in the party, becoming Bakra's right-hand man, deputy chairman to Bakra of the Revolutionary Command Council, the main decision-making and law-making body in the Iraqi government after 1968. Indeed, from 1972, Saddam was probably as important as Bakra, but moved cautiously lest he be singled out as overambitious. A little bit of detail here is all you need to add to that outline I've given you. And then there are Saddam's political skills as well as his ruthlessness. Saddam had long shown both. From the very beginning, when he assassinated a local government official who had informed against his uncle, to the way he strengthened his position within the Ba'ath Party and his relations with the army, at the same time as building popular support amongst Iraqis, at least his own Sunni people, and how, when necessary, he dealt ruthlessly with potential rivals if they opposed him or were suspected of doing so. So that at the age of 42, Saddam Hussein became the undisputed leader of Iraq. Make sure you are armed with a few examples of both Saddam's political skills and his ruthlessness. And so that leads us to the nature of Saddam's rule. As you can see on the slide, I think there are three key aspects to consider when it comes to the nature of Saddam's rule: dictatorship and the cult of personality, ruthless oppression, but also positive policies. Saddam modelled himself on Stalin, and it showed. His rule was indeed a dictatorship, with Saddam enforcing his personal rule. But it can also be described as a military regime, as totalitarian, as a regime at war with its own people, and yet also as a progressive, modernizing regime. In my ebook, I use all these as headings for a notes framework that includes a column for examples and a column for effects. I suggest you do the same. I'm confident that if you do, you will cover any question you might face on the nature of Saddam's rule. As for the nature of the Shah's rule in Iran, I would highlight four things: Westernization, the insensitivity to Islam that this showed, the fact that so many of his policies failed to benefit the majority of Iranians, and when opponents to his regime demanded a change of direction, the way in which the Shah set out to oppress his people. Again, provide examples for each, and you'll be well covered for the exam. And if you have made a good job of that, as well as covering questions on the nature of the Shah's rule, you will already be explaining why the Iranian Revolution occurred. All you need to add now are some examples of the form opposition to the Shah took, and really, that's some examples of demonstrations. And of course, the ways in which Ayatollah Khomeini opposed him. The thing to emphasize for both these subtopics is the nature of the Shah's rule and why there was a revolution. What is the significance of each factor? Then, of course, you have two wars to consider, the Iran-Iraq War and the Gulf War. I have a really useful suggestion for you when it comes to notes for the causes of the Iran-Iraq War. Think about long-term fundamental issues, like the vacancy for leader of the Arab world, created by Nasser's death in 1970, the division within the Muslim community between Shiite Muslims and Sunni Muslims, made worse by the Iranian Revolution, and long-held territorial disputes between Iran and Iraq. And then think of short-term triggers, like Saddam's ambitions to lead the Arab world, the revolution in Iran and Khomeini's call for Shiite Iraqis to rise up, overthrow Saddam and introduce a second Islamic Republic. On the other hand, the revolution in Iran created an opportunity for Saddam to position Iraq and himself as the leading force in the region. And Saddam's use of long-held territorial disputes. You need to add, again, a little detail, examples where appropriate, and give your assessment as to the significance of each factor, always remembering to justify judgments. But this will cover you for exam questions. As for the war itself, don't neglect the bloody nature of the war and the stages it went through. But you should also focus on Western involvement and to the ways in which the Gulf states responded. And I would suggest 2 three-pronged attacks as to the war's consequences. Consider the consequences on Iraq, on Iran, and on the Gulf, and the wider world. And for each of these 3 prongs, think of the human cost, the economic cost, and the political consequences. And so that leaves us with just the Gulf War to consider. What caused it? I would refer to the historical claims Iraq had on Kuwait, as well as Iraq's claims that Kuwait was conducting an economic war against Iraq. And I would move on to factors coming out of the Iran-Iraq war. Saddam's need to reassert himself in the aftermath of the war, and his ambition to make Iraq the dominant power in the region, and himself the leader of the Arab world. You might also need to explain the coalition against Iraq, and so the reasons for so many Gulf states joining it, and America's reasons and those of other Western states. The war began with massive airstrikes and the nature of the offensive on the ground. That it was to liberate Kuwait and not instigate a regime change should be a part of your revision too. And of course, the consequences, the immediate consequences for ordinary Iraqis, but Shiites and Kurds particularly, and the longer-term consequences as sanctions were imposed as the search went on for weapons of mass destruction. So there you have the Gulf topic, and indeed the core. We've covered a lot of ground, and I hope it's proved useful for you. I'll move on to the German depth study, but for now, as always, I will thank you for listening. Good luck with your revision and the very best of luck in your exam. Cheers.